Something is breaking in America, and you can feel it even if you can't explain it. And I need you to hear this, because the data is now so alarming that experts are saying privately what politicians are terrified to admit publicly. There is something very, very wrong with this country. We're talking about a nation where life expectancy just dropped to its lowest point in 30 years, where 46% of Americans can't cover a $500 emergency, where trust in government is the lowest ever recorded, and where violent incidents on planes, in schools, and in hospitals have surged over 50% since 2019. You are living in a country where 1 in 8 U.S. counties now has 0 practicing doctors, where over 70% of critical infrastructure is past its life expectancy, and where 3/4 of young adults say they don't believe the American dream is real anymore. And the craziest part? Everyone senses the collapse, yet almost no one understands why it's happening or how close we are to a point of no return. So buckle up, because once you see the full picture, you're going to realize this isn't a political issue or a cultural issue or an economic issue. It's all of them happening at once. There's a strange, almost unsettling moment happening right now across the entire country, and I want you to really sit with this, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The institutions that once held this country together, from public education to state licensing boards to municipal planning departments, are failing at a pace we have not seen in modern American history. And somehow, no one is talking about it with the seriousness it deserves. And I'm not saying this as hyperbole or political theatrics. I'm saying it because the data is screaming it. For example, according to the latest assessments from the National Center for Education Statistics, U.S. reading and math proficiency among 13-year-olds dropped to the lowest levels since the 1970s, wiping out 5 decades of educational progress in less than 4 years, a collapse that would have been unthinkable 20 years ago. Teacher vacancies have tripled since 2012, with states like Texas reporting more than 13,000 unfilled teaching positions, and others resorting to hiring people with no educational background whatsoever to manage classrooms. Then step outside education and look at the infrastructure permitting process. In United States, it now takes an average of 7.2 years to approve a large-scale infrastructure project. Compare that to Germany, where it's roughly 3, or Japan, where it's under 2. Meanwhile, local governments are experiencing chronic administrative shortages, retirement waves combined with low recruitment leading to 911 call centers running on skeleton crews, building inspections delayed months, and critical zoning decisions being made by boards that can't even fill quorum. And I'm telling you this because the consequences aren't abstract, they ripple into everything. Slower construction projects mean higher housing prices. Slower licensing processes mean fewer nurses entering the workforce. Slower municipal response means more crime going unaddressed. And yet, when you bring this up, people shrug like it's just how things are now, as though a nation that once built the Hoover Dam in 5 years and sent humans to space on computers weaker than your phone somehow can't figure out how to approve a subway line without drowning it in a decade of paperwork. There is something fundamentally broken in the machinery that keeps society functioning. And the most alarming part is not the failure itself, it's how normalized the failure has become. Because when incompetence becomes the baseline, decline isn't an event. It becomes the operating system. The economic dislocation no one wants to admit is happening. Something else is happening in this country that almost feels taboo to mention out loud, but if you don't acknowledge it, you're sleepwalking through the biggest structural shift in the modern economy. The United States is undergoing a historic labor market distortion where entire categories of work are disappearing faster than people can retrain, while other sectors are collapsing under the weight of labor shortages, not because of immigration, not because no one wants to work, but because the demographic math simply does not add up anymore. And I want you to follow me here because the numbers are shocking. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics reports that for the first time since records began, America has more retirees than children entering the workforce, meaning that every year the labor pool shrinks while demand for workers grows. Healthcare alone needs 3.2 million additional workers by 2030, yet training programs are producing fewer nurses and technicians than they did 15 years ago. Meanwhile, automation isn't just hitting manufacturing, it's eating into logistics, transportation, customer service, and even white-collar analytical roles. Warehouses in Ohio run 40% automated workflows. Trucking fleets are piloting autonomous convoys across the Nevada interstate system, and major financial institutions have quietly cut thousands of analyst positions after rolling out generative AI risk modeling systems. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The pace of displacement is now faster than the pace of adaptation, which has never happened before in American economic history. You can already see the consequences: entire regions hollowing out as mid-wage jobs vanish, younger adults clustering into a handful of megacities, rural hospitals shutting down because they can't find staff, and small businesses fighting for employees who simply do not exist in sufficient numbers. But the part most people miss is this. The country's economic model was built on the assumption of perpetual population growth, an assumption that is now mathematically broken. Birth rates have collapsed to 1.6, below replacement level for 15 straight years. Immigration, contrary to political rhetoric, has been not too high, but too inconsistent to stabilize the workforce. And when you combine demographic contraction with rapid automation, you get the fragility we're living in now. Soaring labor costs in essential sectors, falling wages in others, mismatches everywhere, and a political system completely unprepared to manage the transition. This isn't a temporary imbalance. It's a structural rewriting of how the economy works, and the country is stumbling through it without a map. What's even more disturbing, because this is something people feel every single day without understanding the full scope, is that the American healthcare system is no longer struggling or under pressure. It is entering what experts are now calling a structural death spiral, a mathematically unavoidable collapse driven by workforce shortages, rising costs, declining access, and a demographic surge that no amount of policy tinkering can stop. And I want you to understand how dangerously close we are to a system-wide failure, because this isn't speculation. The numbers are published by the American Hospital Association, the U.S. Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and several independent research groups. Right now, more than 31% of all rural hospitals in the United States are at immediate risk of closure due to financial insolvency, meaning nearly 1 in 3 could shut their doors within the next 24 to 36 months. Emergency departments are closing faster than they can be replaced, leaving communities in Mississippi, Oklahoma, and Arkansas with care deserts, where the nearest ER may be over an hour away. On top of that, the healthcare workforce is collapsing from both ends. 1 in 5 nurses plan to leave the profession within 5 years, and the Association of American Medical Colleges warns that the U.S. will face a physician shortage of up to 86,000 doctors by 2036. And while politicians shout slogans about lowering costs, the math is the real horror story. Medical inflation is rising faster than core inflation, and for the first time we are seeing insurers deny claims at rates above 20% for certain categories, effectively rationing care without ever admitting it publicly. But the dark part, the part no one wants to talk about, is what happens when aging boomers enter their highest cost medical years while the tax base shrinks and the workforce that supports the system thins out. Medicare. Part A, according to the trustees' report, becomes insolvent in 2031, and the gap required to stabilize it would require either massive tax increases or politically impossible benefit cuts. In other words, the system is not bending, it's in the early stages of breaking. And when healthcare collapses, everything collapses. Workforce productivity, emergency preparedness, national security, even life expectancy, already declining in the U.S., begins to fall in ways that mark true national decline. Something is very, very wrong with the country when the wealthiest nation in history cannot keep its hospitals open. The information ecosystem has become too broken to sustain a functional democracy. Starting from a completely different angle, one of the most dangerous and least acknowledged problems in the United States right now is the implosion of the information ecosystem, a breakdown so severe that it threatens the basic cognitive infrastructure a democracy depends on to function. And I'm not talking about the usual buzzwords, fake news, misinformation, media bias. I'm talking about a measurable collapse in truth processing capability across the population, documented by institutions like the Pew Research Center and the Stanford Internet Observatory. For example, a 2025 study found that 42% of Americans cannot distinguish between AI-generated political statements and real ones, meaning nearly half the country cannot tell whether a policy claim came from a verified source or an algorithm trained to maximize engagement. Add to that the fact that roughly 70% of Americans under 30 now get their news primarily from TikTok, Instagram, or YouTube, platforms optimized not for accuracy, but for emotional stimulation and shareability. And this would be concerning even if the average media consumer were highly literate, but literacy itself is collapsing, with adult reading comprehension dropping to mid-1990s levels and critical reasoning scores falling below those of nearly every advanced economy tracked by the OECD. The result is a population that is increasingly trapped inside algorithmically generated realities bubbles so airtight that even basic shared facts dissolve. You can already see the consequences. Voters basing political decisions on viral clips that are either contextless or manipulated. Conspiracy theories spreading faster than the truth can catch up. Public discourse devolving into micro-tribes speaking different informational languages. And here's the part that should terrify you, not figuratively, not rhetorically, but genuinely. There is now no central authority, no institution, no media organization trusted by a majority of Americans to validate reality itself. Not one. The last time the country had this degree of fractured information coherence was the late 1850s, and historians widely attribute that period's informational chaos as one of the accelerants of national fracture leading into the Civil War. But today, the velocity is exponentially faster because algorithms can shape public perception at scale in milliseconds. When a nation loses the ability to agree on what is real, democratic decision-making stops being possible, and politics becomes not a debate but a collision of incompatible realities. That is where we are right now. Something is profoundly wrong with a country where people cannot even agree on the existence of shared truth. The nation's financial plumbing is failing in ways most people don't see until it's too late. To understand the next issue, you have to pay attention to something the average person never thinks about. The financial plumbing of the country, the payment systems, the clearinghouses, the municipal bond markets, the shadow banking architecture that keeps the U.S. economic engine running beneath the surface. And right now, that system is showing cracks so deep that even insiders are starting to panic quietly. What's happening is this bizarre, slow-moving crisis where liquidity mismatches, unregulated lending, and municipal fiscal decay are converging into what analysts at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York describe as systemic fragility masked by temporary liquidity. And here's what that means in plain English. The system only works as long as interest rates stay low and credit keeps flowing, and both of those conditions are now mathematically impossible to sustain. For example, U.S. household debt is now $17.8 trillion, a record, with auto loan delinquencies hitting their highest level since 1996, and credit card delinquencies rising faster than during the 2008 crisis according to the Federal Reserve Board. But the part no one sees is what's happening in commercial real estate and municipal finance. Office vacancies in major cities like San Francisco and Chicago have crossed 30%, wiping out the tax base that funds schools, transit, fire departments, and the basic functioning of local government. The result? Cities are being forced into deficit spending while simultaneously rolling over old debts at double or triple the previous interest rates. Municipal bankruptcies, which have historically been rare, are projected to surge, and the domino effect is terrifying. When a city defaults, pensions destabilize, essential services shut down, and property values collapse. Meanwhile, the shadow banking sector, private credit funds, unregulated lenders, leveraged real estate trusts now exceeds $1.7 trillion, operating largely outside the oversight of agencies like the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. These funds are now major lenders to mid-size companies that can't afford traditional financing at today's interest rates. If one large fund freezes withdrawals, as happened in late 2025 with 2 private credit pools on the East Coast, the liquidity shock ripples instantly into the real economy. The bottom line is this: the financial system is being held together by confidence, not fundamentals, and confidence is the one resource the country is rapidly running out of. When the financial plumbing corrodes, collapse doesn't start on Wall Street, it starts in your paycheck, your mortgage rate, your city budget, and the price of every necessity you buy. And right now, the corrosion is accelerating. Beginning from an entirely different dimension of decline, the most alarming sign that something is profoundly wrong with the country isn't economic or political, it's social. And the data shows a level of fragmentation, alienation, and civic deterioration that looks less like a healthy society and more like a nation entering late-stage cohesion failure. And I know that sounds dramatic, but the research is chilling. According to the U.S. Surgeon General, chronic loneliness has now reached epidemic levels, with 52% of young adults reporting they have no close friends, a statistic unheard of in any previous generation. Violent incidents on airlines, in hospitals, in schools, and on public transit have surged anywhere from 20% to 60%, depending on the category. Public school systems already weakened are reporting behavioral disruptions at levels teachers say have not existed in modern memory. Meanwhile, the FBI's 2025 Uniform Crime Report notes a disturbing shift. While some traditional crime categories have declined, randomized violence, interpersonal disputes, and group-based confrontations have increased, which criminologists say is a hallmark of social instability rather than economic-driven crime. But it gets darker. Marriage rates are at their lowest levels ever recorded. Birth rates have collapsed to 1.6. Trust in neighbors is at an all-time low. And community institutions, PTAs, churches, civic organizations, are shrinking or disappearing entirely. And these aren't just cultural developments. They have measurable economic and political consequences. Countries with low social cohesion historically struggle to maintain democratic stability, workforce productivity, and resilience in crises. Look at the OECD Social Cohesion Index. The U.S. now ranks near the bottom among advanced economies, below Chile and Estonia. And here's the part most people miss. Social fabric collapse isn't linear. It accelerates. Once norms erode respect for institutions, shared identity, willingness to compromise, they don't gradually rebuild. They unravel faster with every shock. You can already see it in politics, where compromise has become impossible, in workplaces where turnover is at record highs, and in communities where people treat one another not as neighbors, but as threats. A country can survive recessions, pandemics, even geopolitical conflict, but no country has ever survived the collapse of its own social cohesion without entering a period of profound transformation or instability. And right now, the United States is drifting toward that precipice with the public barely aware of the danger. The country's energy grid is one major shock away from a nationwide breakdown. What almost nobody realizes because it's not trending on social media, it's not packaged into a 10-second outrage clip, and it requires you to actually look at the engineering reports, is that the U.S. power grid is degrading so rapidly that experts at the North American Electric Reliability Corporation now warn that half the country faces high risk of extended outages during peak seasons, meaning we are one heat wave, one cyber attack, or one supply chain disruption away from a cascading failure that could take down power for tens of millions of people. And the truly shocking part is that this isn't some theoretical doomsday scenario predicted by bloggers. It is documented in federal reliability assessments, cybersecurity audits, and grid stability models produced by the U.S. Department of Energy. Right now, more than 70% of America's transmission lines are over 25 years old, nearing or exceeding their engineered lifespan, while electricity demand continues climbing due to data centers, heat pumps, EV adoption, and AI-driven industrial expansion. Yet grid expansion has slowed to a crawl. Major transmission projects take 10 to 15 years to build in the U.S., compared to 2 to 5 years in countries like South Korea or United Arab Emirates. But aging equipment is only half the crisis, the other half is cybersecurity. Since 2020, attempts by foreign actors, primarily traced to units within Russia and China, to penetrate U.S. grid networks have increased tenfold, according to congressional testimony from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and at least 9 incidents forced utilities to manually intervene to prevent large-scale shutdowns. Add to this an unprecedented surge in severe weather, with billion-dollar climate disasters striking at triple the 1990s rate, and you get a grid stretched past its design limits, repeatedly pushed into emergency mode. And here's the part that should terrify every American. Once you lose a major section of the grid, restoring it isn't like flipping a switch. Black start capability systems designed to restart power plants from zero are aging and insufficient, and in some regions, there aren't enough black start units to bring the grid back online quickly. A weeks-long outage would halt water treatment, emergency services, hospitals, and food distribution. The modern economy doesn't just rely on electricity, it is electricity. When the grid fails, civilization fails with it. And right now, the indicators point to a system approaching a breaking point. Approaching the situation from an even more unsettling angle, the United States, long assumed to possess the strongest, most prepared military on Earth, is quietly slipping into a readiness crisis that internal reports describe as strategically unacceptable and operationally dangerous. And the American public has almost no idea how serious the deterioration has become. According to the most recent assessments from the U.S. Department of Defense, 55% of Army units are not at full readiness. The Navy is short over 18,000 sailors, and the Air Force is operating with a pilot deficit so large, roughly 2,000 trained aviators, that it now trains fewer fighter pilots than it did in the 1980s, despite facing a global landscape of far more advanced threats. But the personnel crisis is only the visible surface. Maintenance backlogs have reached historic highs. 40% of Navy attack submarines are currently in dry dock or awaiting repair, a bottleneck caused by aging shipyards and decades of deferred investment. Meanwhile, adversaries are accelerating modernization. China now launches more naval tonnage every 4 years than the U.S. launches in a decade, and the Defense Intelligence Agency reports that China possesses the world's largest navy by ship count. And while the U.S. still leads in high-end capabilities, the logistical system supporting those capabilities is collapsing. The stockpile of 155mm artillery shells critical in any high-intensity conflict fell so low during 2024 to 2025 that the Pentagon had to fast-track contracts for emergency production lines just to maintain minimum thresholds. Even more alarming, war game simulations conducted by the RAND Corporation repeatedly show the U.S. running out of precision-guided munitions within weeks of a major conflict, while adversaries maintain larger reserves. And then there's recruitment. The Army missed its 2025 recruiting target by 41%, the worst shortfall in modern history, driven by declining youth fitness, rising disqualification rates, and a generational distrust of institutions. A military cannot project strength when it lacks bodies, equipment, and logistics, and right now, the U.S. is struggling on all 3 fronts simultaneously. For the first time since World War II, America is facing an environment where its global dominance is not just challenged, it may no longer be structurally sustainable unless massive reforms occur. When a superpower loses readiness, deterrence collapses. And when deterrence collapses, conflict follows. That is how great powers fall. The collapse of governmental capacity is becoming impossible to ignore. What's becoming disturbingly clear because every new report, audit, and investigation points in the same catastrophic direction is that the core functions of the U.S. government are breaking down in ways that even seasoned policy experts say they have never witnessed in their lifetimes. And the scariest part is how quietly it's happening. According to recent analyses from the U.S. Government Accountability Office, over 40% of critical federal agencies now fail to meet minimum operational standards, meaning they cannot deliver the basic services they are legally required to provide. The Internal Revenue Service still carries technology older than most millennials. The agency processes millions of returns using code written in the 1960s, and a single software outage in 2025 delayed tax refunds for nearly 12 million Americans. Meanwhile, the Federal Emergency Management Agency has officially warned Congress that disaster response capacity is now structurally insufficient, With federal disaster funds running dry twice in the last 3 years, something unprecedented since the agency's founding. And it gets darker. Regulatory agencies are losing technical expertise faster than they can replace it due to mass retirements and a private sector that poaches talent with salaries the government cannot match. The National Transportation Safety Board has publicly stated that they no longer have enough trained investigators to assess major aviation, rail, and pipeline accidents. Immigration case backlogs have surpassed 9 million. Social Security wait times have doubled, and veterans seeking care through the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs now wait an average of 124 days for disability decisions delays that internal audits describe as life-threatening. But the most disturbing indicator of governmental collapse is the rise in unresolved crises. Water systems failing in states like Mississippi, contaminated municipal pipes in Flint, chronic understaffing across air traffic control, and federal cybersecurity teams warning that they cannot defend against simultaneous attacks on critical infrastructure. A government can survive unpopularity. It can survive gridlock. What it cannot survive is functional incapacity, the inability to execute. And right now, the United States is operating with agencies so overwhelmed, understaffed, outdated, and structurally fragile that one significant national emergency, whether cyber, environmental, economic, or geopolitical, could overwhelm the system entirely. That is not hyperbole. That's the government's own internal documentation. Something is catastrophically wrong with the country when the machinery of the state itself is seizing up. The country is moving toward a level of internal instability not seen since the 1860s. From an even more sobering vantage point, the most explosive and unsettling problem facing the United States today is the accelerating drift toward internal instability, a level of political, cultural, and civic fracture that scholars at the Brookings Institution and the Harvard Kennedy School openly compare to the pre-Civil War period, except now the fissures are amplified by digital echo chambers, demographic divides, and institutional fatigue that the 19th century never had to contend with. And you can see this fracture everywhere. 67% of Americans believe the country is on the verge of political collapse according to Pew Research Center, and over 1/3 expect some form of political violence within the next decade. States are openly defying federal courts. Local sheriffs refuse to enforce federal laws. Some governors in 2025 even threatened to deploy state National Guard units in defiance of federal directives, an institutional showdown that constitutional experts say is the closest we have come to nullification since the 1830s. Meanwhile, political polarization has hardened into identity-based tribalism, where people no longer disagree over policies but over the legitimacy of institutions and even the legitimacy of elections themselves. This isn't normal ideological disagreement, it's a rupture in the foundation of shared national identity. And here's the part that historians find most alarming. Once societies cross the threshold where groups view one another not as opponents, but as existential threats, the slide into unrest becomes historically predictable. Add in an economy marked by inequality, a collapsing information ecosystem, a fraying social fabric, and declining institutional competence, and you get the exact multivariable conditions that political scientists at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace identify as precursors to internal conflict. In 2025 alone, politically motivated attacks increased by nearly 32%, and federal law enforcement warned that extremist recruitment across the ideological spectrum has reached levels unseen since the 1970s. The United States is not on the brink of civil war in the Hollywood sense, but it is entering a phase of deep instability where governance becomes erratic, public trust collapses, and political violence becomes normalized. No advanced democracy has ever thrived in this environment. Most either fracture, stagnate, or transform under pressure. Something is profoundly, historically wrong with the country. When the warning signs of systemic internal rupture are no longer subtle, they're flashing like a siren, and the nation is still pretending not to hear them. All right? If you made it this far, then you already understand what most people in this country still refuse to admit. We are living through a moment of historic instability, and pretending everything is fine is no longer an option. Because every indicator from the economy to the grid to the social fabric is pointing in the same direction, And the worst thing you could possibly do right now is look away and hope it just works itself out. It won't. Not this time. So here's what I need from you. Do not click off this video and forget what you just learned. Do not let this become background noise. Share it. Comment on it. Send it to someone who still thinks all of this is normal, because the only reason countries collapse is that people stay silent until it's too late, and by the time they wake up, the damage is already woven into the system. And if you want to stay ahead of what's coming, not the headlines, not the talking points, but the real underlying forces shaping the next decade, then make sure you're subscribed, notifications turned on, because this is only the beginning. The data is evolving every week, the warning signs are accelerating, and I'm going to keep breaking this down piece by piece so you're not blindsided like everyone else. Seriously, stay sharp, stay informed, and most importantly, stay aware, because the country you grew up in is changing faster than anyone wants to admit. I'll see you in the next one.